Yes, I'm being followed by a moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow. Leaping and hopping on a moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow. And if I ever lose my hands, lose my plow, lose my lands, and if I ever lose my hands, way I won't have to work no more. And if I ever lose my eyes, if my colors all run dry, and if I ever lose my eyes, way I won't have to cry no more. Yes, I'm being followed by a moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow. Leaping and hopping on a moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow. Moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow, moon shadow. Well, that was a Cat Stevens classic, and I played it because of a poem I discussed with today's guest, Arya Antherjanam. Arya is the second poet I'm interviewing consecutively. I'd initially planned to have a sort of double poets episode because I'm interested in the status of poetry in our society as a popular or more underground art, about its relationship to songwriters, whether, poets hang out together at open mics and feel the same kind of magic as singer-songwriters do. Spoiler, they do, and my guest Arya today, she has a great poem about that. So without further ado, here's Arya Antherjanam. I'm joined by Arya Antherjanam, aka Teeny Tiny Fables. Originally, as you know, I was going to have both you and Aditya Kapoor on at the same time, a fellow poet. That interview ended up going for half an hour, so I guess I'm glad I didn't. But the reason I wanted to have two poets on at the same time, I was inspired by this thing Bob Dylan said about how, nowadays lots of people have favorite singers, they can quote lyrics, but when he was growing up 70 years ago, people actually knew poets. They had favorite poets, they could quote things. So you're in now, I guess, this more out there art form. So what made you fall in love with poetry, and what are your thoughts about the art form these days?
Sure. First of all, hey Zach, it's good to be here. And yeah, so it's only very recently that I started calling myself a poet, which I still doubt some days. How it started was that I fell in love with words. So playing with words, reading them or writing them or creating them were a way of escape for me from the reality. So as a school kid, I had these journals or diaries where I used to write every day my thoughts and my feelings and my experiences and all those things. And so that words were a way of escape for me. And the more I started reading, the more I started consuming them. When I create words, I kind of feel a power over my emotions, over my feelings, or I get to put it in a way that I feel comfortable with. So that was how I started writing. And when I started writing, it was poetry was all rhymes and alliterations and all those, figures of speech for me. And I think I wrote my first poem when I was 15, which I can't call a poem now when I look back. But then after that, I took a break for like 2, 3 years. Then I wrote another one, and then it kind of kept on happening. And all my initial works were mainly rhymes and alliterations, and which like it was more of a conventional way of poetry. But it's only recently, maybe just a couple or 3 years back, that I got into free verse form of poetry, where I just go with the flow and uh, just give the words the freedom they want to acquire. So I think, yeah, so art is freedom for me. Art is therapy for me.
Though I'm hearing some contradictions. So you say that thing you wrote at 15 was not a poem, but you
Yeah.
also don't want to define the constraints of a poem. So if you can remember, why was that not a poem?
Yeah, because I think it was very amateur, but when I wrote it, I considered it a poem. Okay. But as I started taking the poetry or the art more seriously, I thought it did have some, downsides. And but now when I see it, it was fine. Like it was not a fully free verse, and but it also had some rhymes. But I don't know. I think that art is free, but it also has some kind of a discipline. But you should let the words flow. Yes, that's true. But yeah, I think I'm still figuring out what poetry actually means and what art can do to the words.
Right. I guess do you have standards you can put into words for assessing what makes free verse good, what makes it a poem and not just an amateur writing sentences on a page?
Yeah, I think it should have a flow. It should, I think it should speak to you because it's a free word. It's more like a conversation. Yeah, it should trigger some emotion inside you. It's not necessary that I wrote with a particular emotion and you perceive the same emotion. But if those words trigger some kind of emotion in you and you can relate to it in some way, or if it makes you think, if it disturbs you, if it bothers you, then I think it's a good poetry. And yeah, and you cannot actually judge anyone's soul of the art. That's what I strongly believe in. You can comment on the craft of the piece, but you cannot judge the soul of the piece because it's coming from something very emotional and personal. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly one of my frustrations with some other arts is, when people telling you it's not genuine, and then that person is just, they can't imagine someone who doesn't think like them. But anyway, one of your poems is called "For What Binds Us." It talks about a community of poets, and this makes me think back to music, because for me, a big inspiration in writing songs is thinking back to what for me is an essentially imaginary time of the 1960s, when all these famous folk singers were playing in small clubs in New York and all hearing each other at the same time. For you, what does that dream of community mean?
Yeah, right. So I started performing or putting my out there in a public platform like 2 3 years ago, and it's only during the lockdown that I started performing, and I started interacting with a lot of artists, both poets, storytellers, and also musicians and all other kinds of artists. And I'm also a part of some artist communities. And so the vibe that I feel when I am surrounded by fellow artists is that, even they are trying. They are, I know that they are also not perfect. They're also trying as I am trying. So there is a relatability factor that inspires me to create my art in a better way, and to be more disciplined and to be consistent and to be appreciative of the art. So when I read when I read a classic literature, I have an admirability factor. Like I admire the work, but I cannot actually think that, oh, maybe I can also do it. But when I read a piece written by my fellow poet, I can kind of relate to it, not just in words but also in the craft of it. So that keeps me grounded, that keeps me grateful for the art, and yeah, that keeps me motivated to do
Right.
better.
And are you saying that's because you know these poets, or is it just something about poetry? So can you even read a famous poet and have that feeling?
Yeah, I think it's because I know they're also starting out and they're also trying to get their feet in the art. That does work. That does work for me. But maybe, like there are also poets like Maya Angelou and Sylvia Plath. When they read the poems, there is kind of an emotion that is triggered inside, which I can write about. I could write about that emotion, but I don't think I'll think that, okay, maybe I'll write like them. But yeah, I think it's both art and also knowing that the fellow artists are also starting out. They're also, you know, they're also in that process of making better art.
Right. Do you have favorite poems?
Um, it was by Emily Dickinson. I could not stop for death. He stopped for me. It was the poem, so that was very touching. And yeah, but I also like I Still Rise, like Phoenix I Still Rise, and I also like Khalil Gibran's poems. But yeah, I really can't just pick one. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
because
Mhm.
yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead. Because what I was thinking is, you know, can one experience a poem the same way one experiences a song? And I have a limited relationship to Sylvia Plath because there's audio of her reading her poems, and she has a very distinct voice. But I mean, that's really it. There aren't many other poets who I've heard in that way. And, you know, with songs, almost everyone, music lover or not, has their favorite, but poetry might be a completely different world in that regard.
Yeah, that's true. I think page poetry and spoken word poetry also impact me very differently. So when you put your words in writing and when someone reads it, there is a different kind of perspective than when someone else is reading your poem. So recently Mike had this poetry corner kind of episode in his page, and he was reading out my poem. And when he was reading out that piece, it was so soothing, it was so calming. And I reflected on how I would read that poem. And I figured that when I read that, it was more of aggression or anger that was related to that piece. So I think, yes, I believe and I really like that people perceive the same kind of same piece of poetry in very different ways.
Okay, so you never feel threatened or embarrassed if someone gets something wrong like that?
No, I really enjoy it. Actually, I actually try to get their perspective of things and try to find out why they feel that emotion instead of my emotion. So I think that's fun.
Right, because I would think that's one of the real challenges of poetry, that most great poets do not speak plainly or using metaphor and other kinds of imagery. And yet if you have convictions about the world, you wouldn't want people to get those convictions wrong, but obviously not. Maybe this is why I'm not a poet.
Yeah, oh my God, yeah.
Do you, so another of your poems I like, and I'm just going to read these 3 lines here. It's from Enough. Enough has been said about love and wars. We need more stories on thirst and slumber, on lust and murmur, on slopes and breaks. Can you tell us what you were thinking when you wrote that?
Yeah, I think it was kind of breaking stereotypes. That was the emotion I had. Maybe I was done with the love poems, or maybe I was done with the poems on grief and heartbreaks and pain and mundane things of life, and also the grandeur things like success and wisdom and inspiration. So I wanted to write about little things which people may not notice, like a very dry flower in my window or something like that. So yeah, I was really done with all the glorification that only a part of art or a part of world gets.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing I had hoped to ask you and Aditya together, you both use Instagram to share your poems. And so you'll just take photographs and put them against your poems. So for this one, you have this interesting statue where it's like a giant head, but it's kind of melting from the side. Can you tell us a bit about that image?
Yeah, so most of the pictures that are associated in my page are not clicked by me. Most of them are clicked by my brother or my friends or someone, but this particular one was clicked by me. This is a statue in Amsterdam. And when I looked at that statue, I just felt that, you know, that person doesn't have ears or hands or anything. And the first thought that came to me was that, you know, when many things that you thought are basic are taken away from you, you still find a way of figuring out how to live, or you still kind of try to figure out what to do. So that was a thought I had when I clicked that photo. But when I looked at it some time later, and I had this thought in my mind that, you know, I'm done with all these conventions and I want to have a fresh perspective. And I kind of thought that, you know, this club, like this fits together.
Yeah. So when I saw the statue, when I heard your first explanation, I assumed it was just statue represents the great things like love and wars. But yeah, you saw something completely different in it. You saw the statue as unconventional, not conventional.
See, that's cool. You had a different perspective than I had, which is cool.
On the one hand, you do this Instagram thing, but also you've gone the more traditional route. So you've been involved in publishing some anthologies. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So I have co-authored 2 anthologies where, like, I have 2 of my poems in each of them. So this is by some publishers in India, and they have like a group of writers came together around 80 or 100 writers came together, which each of them with their own piece, and we kind of published it with the publisher. But yeah, but I haven't done much on the publication side yet. Maybe I'll do in the future. But
Well,
yeah,
that's more than most
only
people have done. Is there any theme to the poems you included in that?
Yeah, so one of the book was called Melodies of Life, and the other is called Field of Hues. Both are available in Amazon, by the way. It was kind of different poems, like all the different pieces in those books were from different perspectives, written by people from different backgrounds with different experiences. So it was kind of a whole spectrum where you can have all the emotions. And one of my poems in one of them was about writing poem, that how some days you can write a poem like word after word, and but some days you just can't write however much you try. But yeah, so that was that.
Right. And is all your writing in English?
Yeah, so I mostly write in English. I also write in Hindi, but that's not my mother tongue. I don't write in my mother tongue yet. But yeah, some days I hope that I do.
So are there structures to Hindi that would make poetry writing, what you can do with wordplay, radically different?
I think the rhyme structure kind of strikes the audience when they're hearing Hindi poetry. So most of my Hindi pieces are more of a spoken word poetry than a page poetry. So there is kind of a structure, as in a tune to it when you say it, or there is there's some kind of a rhythm to it as you say it. And I think also emotions also portray in a very pronounced manner. Yeah.
So you also said you were part of some sort of collective that tries to promote poetry during the pandemic. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, right. So I'm a part of this. So I have collaborated with this community where we curate personal sessions for people who are affected by COVID. It can be those who are in quarantine because of COVID, or who are just in home quarantine, or even the frontline workers, who have been working against this for like couple of years now. So our aim is to help them take the mental load off. So what we do is, when we identify someone who might be in need of such a session where they can use a good dose of poetry and good vibes and just some warm session, we reach out to them. We ask them for their personal preferences, like the kind of music they like, the kind of series they watch, the kind of art they would like to hear, and then we kind of curate different sessions. So in each session we will have poetry or some meditations, or storytelling or play narration or games and music, and yeah, it's just a very warm collective. And
No, it sounds amazing. So have people been receptive to this? Like how do you find the people to share this experience with?
Yeah. So when we started it, we were a bit skeptical that if a stranger would like to come to our team and be with us for like 2-3 hours just to listen to us. But then we really had an opposite kind of reaction when we recently had 2 volunteers who are working relentlessly for providing COVID support, providing bed and ventilators and stuff for COVID affected patients. And they came to us, and we were together for like a couple of hours. They shared the stories. They shared the stories of the patients they could help, and they shared how helpless they feel when some of them die. Like they feel really helpless, and they really feel that guilt and shame, and they also break down even when they're trying to help others. And all of us were very vulnerable, and they shared their stories, and we shared our art form, and they were very receptive of it. And since we are curating these sessions in a very personal manner, like first consulting them about their preferences, I think that also helps. But the whole vibe of the session is very, very empowering.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of this story from my past, and I'd call it a trauma, except trauma is way too strong a word. So there were 2 7th grade math classes at my school, and we had this assignment where we both had to come up with a business. And my class's business was to make a school newspaper, and the other class's business was to pick up coffee for people. And, the unsurprising lesson is that the one that picked up coffee for people made a lot more money than the one that was a student created newspaper. And I remember we had to write reflections on the time. And I think the teacher wanted us to write about how we should have known that coffee was a better business. And I was thinking, well, no, we did something more meaningful. But I think
Yeah.
still then I've always had the sense, I love the arts, but unless you're famous, no one is ever going to give you the time of day. But it sounds like you've overcome that. You made it work, and you're doing charity and self-fulfillment at the same time. It's just great.
Yeah, it's great that some things work out together when we least expect it to be, but yeah.
So did you give us
That's
the name of this organization? Is it something people can look up?
Yeah, so the community is called Sectorhood, and this particular project is called Art Against COVID, or
Okay.
Artist Against COVID. Yeah.
All right. Well, Arya, this has been great. Do you have some poems you can share with us?
Yeah, sure. Just okay. So this piece is called "I Sleep 2 Feet Away from My Mother." This has a trigger warning, though. There is a slight mention of anxiety and self-harm in this. Okay. I step into the bed and lay 2 feet to my mother's left. I lay sideways, looking at her strands dancing on her chin. I cannot turn the other side because I'm scared. I want to tell her I'm scared, but I don't. Because I sleep 2 feet away from my mother. Because I know I carry needles in my chest and stones in my arms. She has balloons on her back and flowers on her hands. It has been this way for weeks now. I don't try to trace back her strands from the face because all I ever do is burn them. I want to tell her I'm scared, that the slightest tremor of my eyelids will spill the stupendous serenity of seashore, that whenever I turn to my left, there are demons waiting for my mouth. And the worst part is, they won't even kiss it. That if I don't stare at my breakfast for 2 minutes, I can't quite chew it because I have been told to act like a friend before choking them to stillness. She wept last night because she couldn't remember what happened to my brother when he was 3. And instead of holding her close, I turned to my left. First time in ages. I wish she knew it's okay to forget some things. And that I also forget her indifference to birthday cards as I run across stores for handwritten floral ones. I want to tell her I'm scared of the face masks hanging outside my window, of death, of the cold numbness it will leave me with. But then I think of the days I craved for that stillness. I'm scared now because it's been returning. I long for a moment of blur where I'll extend my arm and touch on her forehead. Ah, foreheads. I wonder if she was ever kissed there, or if she ever wishes to. And now I know I'll never be able to, because lately I can't get anything right. The sun has been kind to lend me some more words at dawn. I asked for his least favorite ones because I cannot stand wrecking another beautiful word.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking as you were reading that about what you said earlier about how you allow others to the freedom to reinterpret your poems, because that one, it sounded like it must be about something so specific and so intense, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. When you talked about balloons and needles, I assume there must be a hospital involved, but yeah, a lot I'm not sure about, but it was very powerful.
Thank you. So that was actually a very purely fictional piece. The only similarity that had to real life was I was actually sleeping, to my mother's left, and we had a kind of 2 feet difference, and I just, I imagined this dramatic scenario in my head. But yeah.
Right. And were you intending to invoke superstitions in there?
Uh, no, not really. So the balloons and all, it was just that I have all the things that could harm her, and I don't want that.
Right. No, so I was
So,
thinking about the part about the cereal about, like if you look away from something for a few seconds, maybe you're cursing the universe. Was
oh,
that in there and all, or was I just hearing that?
oh wow, no, wow, that's new. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. No,
well,
it was,
amazing.
yeah, this is amazing.
Yeah, so I
I
love that
really
you're one
like
of
this,
those.
like when you have other interpretations of the same piece. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's great that you're one of these poets who's not like, no, this is what my thing is about, and you're an idiot if you don't hear it. I've had that with some music fans, but anyway, was there anything else you wanted to read?
Yeah, so since you mentioned the one about fellow artists, I thought I'll read that one too.
Sounds good.
Okay. So this is called For What Binds Us. No matter how many classics I read, it's my fellow poets who make me want to believe in the magic of breaking down the spell. The ones who find escape in poetry, but not sure what from. The ones who write not to earn and leave, but to fly and bleed. The ones who know that half of what they write is crap. For what binds us is a vicious hunger for the right words, right dots, and right poses. The ache in our heart when the words betray the aura of a comet passing by. The struggle to live in the moment while we leave them as a pre-verse. For what binds us is a look on the face of the words that do not make it to the poem. The sore in our mouth when we gulp them down. For not sounding too obvious. For refraining from menial. The paranoia of readers' eyes grazing between the lines, digging up the heart we buried beneath the most boring vowel. The quest for the seventh Horcrux ending at the grave. For what binds us is the pulse speeding up at the thought of a thief barging into our head, looting us of all the words, putting them exactly the way we wanted, and calling it their poem, at not knowing whether to be terrified or proud of it. That one day we wake up and no stars plummet from the eyes of a lover we lost. No cloak in the room shows talk before tick. No crevices on the palm are devoid of obsolete redness. And the poem looks like a sunset we cannot go back to. Thank you.
Beautiful. And I'm glad you shared that one. I liked it just as much hearing it as I did reading it. But yeah, Arya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I hope you enjoyed my interview with Arya today. It made me think about the fact that, I've tried to read the quote unquote great plays, and theater people say, it's important to do that, but really theater is meant to be watched. And that's obvious with theater, but I'm really starting to get the sense that that's really important with poetry too. Most of the time when we experience poetry, we might read it on the page and might find it okay or even good, but it doesn't stick with us. But maybe poetry is about that moment. I was mesmerized by Aditya's delivery last week, and I had a fascinating time listening to Arya's very emotional performance. And despite the fact that it was so emotional, so invested in it, to learn afterwards that it's this somewhat made up image in her mind and that we can both relate to it so differently, and she just finds that fascinating. It was just a great communal experience with a fellow artist, and I hope to get out to open mics again in future where, even if I prefer the music oriented ones, there are some great poets there who can perform like Arya did today, and can have those great conversations about their work. Anyway, keep on checking out these videos. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.